Hey everybody, this is my first attempt to supplement the chapter that you're reading for this week, chapter 15 on the bureaucracy. I'm going to try to sort of explain a few things as they relate to kind of what's making us do this online. The pandemic and the coronavirus and COVID and governmental response and the role of the bureaucracy in that. I think you're seeing in real life why bureaucracy is so important and why it was unwise for me initially to tell you we weren't going to cover it. So now we are, and let's do it. This, I'm going to start with this box, this big giant box in the systems diagram that you're probably sick of now. Um, Political context matters. That our history, our culture, our belief systems, the way that we organize things really makes a big difference for how we respond to crises like this. And the political environment factors that I think are important for understanding the world right now, or at least our country right now, is that we have a very dominant political philosophy in this country that we all know of liberalism that has as its core a liberty imperative. And what that means is that we are presumed to be private individuals pursuing our private interests and our private passions, and that we only get involved with government when we want to pursue those interests. And so essentially, we're private citizens who get involved in public to promote our cause or our values or our interests. And that means that basically, we like to do things on our own. And that makes it very difficult for us to ensure that people like you and I are going to behave when we're asked to stay inside. That's not true of a place like South Korea or Japan, where they have a very, very deeply embedded communal culture, often called Confucian culture, that is focused on the primary goal of wa, which is order. And so everybody has to suppress their particular individual impulses and desires when it interferes with the social order. We don't have that in our political environment. We're liberals, we're leave me alone, I want to go do my thing. And you see that going on to a great extent right now. That's why a bunch of people were on the beach in California yesterday. And they weren't just young people, by the way, although there were some. The second is our historical development, the way we developed as a country where the states were sovereign before we had a strong national government on, the Articles of Confederation, means that we embrace federalism as the first and preferred choice for dealing with issues. And that means states are on their own unless they can't handle it. And so we are seeing in sort of our system today, this tension right now between someone like Governor Cuomo in New York, who keeps asking President Trump to, take swift national action so that he doesn't have to go on the private market and pay 7 or 8 times what he was paying 3 weeks ago for surgical masks and gowns. The reason that is happening is because we have a system of federalism, and we have to live with those consequences. There are also benefits that we'll talk about probably. The cultural values of the political environment, the value of individualism, as I said, but the other value of mistrust of authority is a strong cultural value in the United States. I grew up in what you might call a blue collar family, although my dad had kind of a professional job. He didn't have a college degree. And one of the things that I used to have to fight in my family with my parents, particularly my mom specifically, is this idea that thinking was a good thing. And whenever she'd get mad at me, she said, "No, your problem is you think too much." That sort of is an example, and again, it's not universal in this country, but of a strong element of a mistrust of those who have authority and expertise. My brother, who was in politics for years, he would say to me, "You don't know anything about politics, you study it." That kind of cultural mistrust of expertise and authority runs deep, and these days is actually a lot stronger than it was 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so that also frames the way things are understood, and also the way things have evolved and the consequences that we might be seeing when we really don't believe public health professionals the way a public health professional might want to be believed. The other thing about it that I want to talk about with regard to the importance of our political environment, those ecological factors, is that, there's this structural dynamic that we've created as a result of this environment that has sort of political authority over the civil service. And so politics and administration is never purely divided the way it is in other countries, particularly places like Great Britain or Germany, where the bureaucracy is essentially left alone. And in the United States, the assumption is that we want politicians steering policy decisions. So they steer the direction of the bureaucracy. And then the bureaucracy does that work. They row. So it's like the difference between steering and rowing a cruise ship, a boat where you're rowing. The rowers are supposed to be the civil servants. The steerers, the coxswain, as they're called, are supposed to be the politicians. And you see that tension going on right now between, for example, President Trump and Anthony Fauci, the NIH official who is probably the highest profile, and we'll talk about him in a minute. So what you see when you respond to a crisis like this is you see this mix of politics and administration. And here's a photo taken last week at a briefing that President Trump was conducting at the White House. And the people behind him, besides being way too close, and you know, you're supposed to be 6 feet apart. They're not even 6 inches apart. You have Vice President Pence on the left, but then you have a whole bunch of other people, and I'm going to point them out to you in a minute. But basically, you have a mix here of politicians or political appointees and professional civil servants. The two that I put arrows above their heads are the two career civil servants, Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx. Fauci, who has been in his position for 36 years, he's the National Institute of Health director of the Office of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, or Infectious Diseases and Allergies, can't remember right now. And Deborah Birx, who is U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, she's been a government employee, first with the military as a physician, since 1980. And so these are long-serving. These are the career civil servants mentioned in the chapter. They have deep knowledge, broad expertise, and broad experience that allows them to know the facts and to sort of provide that advice to the political officials. Everybody else behind President Trump is a political appointee. Vice President Pence technically is not because he was elected, but Seema Varna, who works at HHS, she's the director of Medicare and Medicaid Services, and I can't remember the guy to her right, right behind President Trump. I forget who he is. Sorry about that. And then Ben Carson, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Steve Mnuchin, who is the Secretary of the Treasury. Those are all people appointed by the president who serve as the heads of or the assistant heads of major cabinet departments. These are people that are picked because they support the president's agenda, and their job is to implement that agenda. So you see, even in these press conferences, the conflict. And I'm sure you've seen it if you paid attention. Anthony Fauci often contradicts President Trump. Not so much Vice President Pence, but often President Trump will say something like this malaria drug treatment that he thinks might be a miracle cure. It's the job of someone like Anthony Fauci to sort of spell out the facts. So Civil servants, as you saw in the book, there's a general schedule that determines their pay. Basically, everybody in the same grade and same pay gets the same amount of money, but there is a variation based upon the cost of living in a place like Boston, for example, where you get 29% higher salary because it's very expensive to live in the Boston area for those of you who do it. The same is true in New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago. But if you go out to places like Boise, Idaho, or El Paso, Texas, the cost of living is much lower, and as a result, the schedule amount is a little less. Now, let me briefly explain where you might go if you were to start a government job when you graduate. Most college graduates enter somewhere between GS5 and GS7. And most college graduates start somewhere around step 2 or 3. And the reason is step 1 is usually for people who have requisite experience, but not a college degree in the field that they're looking for, but they have equivalent experience. And so they'll start at the lower step. So your college degree does matter. And if you have a certain expertise like accounting or public finance or science, if you're a biologist or something like that, you might start at a GS7 level. And so, an accounting major, for example, from Providence College, could probably start working at an big time accounting firm for about $100,000 a year, $80,000, $90,000 a year. I don't know exactly right now. Whereas they'll probably start this job in Boston somewhere in the low 50s. And so, government employees don't get a lot of money, uh, particularly when you compare them to their equivalents in the private sector. Why do they take their jobs? Well, they take those jobs because they often have motivations to do so. Anthony Fauci is deeply dedicated to studying infectious diseases and helping to promote public health. The same is true with Dr. Birx. And so, there's usually a motive other than material gain. Usually you want to make a difference. Sometimes you want to do basic research, and government is where most of the basic research gets done. So there are other motivations. Sometimes first generation Americans are much more likely to take a job in government because they feel an obligation to give back, either directly because they moved here when they were children or because their parents did. And so they have enormous gratitude and they often want to give back to their country. So there are other motivations besides simply money, as you can probably figure out. So I wanted to just lay out one division, one department, and look a little bit at the National Institute of Health, just so you get a feel for where Fauci is located. Birx, of course, is in the State Department. Fauci is in the Health and Human Services Department. This is the organization chart for the entire Department of Health and Human Services. And you see, to the left, you have primarily administrative offices. These are often political appointees. Most of the people who lead those offices are political appointees, meaning that the president gets to decide who they're going to be and the Senate confirms them. The people at the right are special things like counsel, global affairs, inspector general, office of civil rights. They make sure that the rules are being followed and that they coordinate with other governments. The offices in the middle or the administrations are called, the administrative units, are doing the implementation of public policy. So the Administration for Children and Families, the top left one, they deal with all laws that allocate to HHS the responsibility for implementing policies like issues of child care and children's health and things like that. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Service, where Seema Varna is the head, she basically oversees the expenditure of the single largest non-defense expenditure, and actually combined, we spend more on Medicare and Medicaid than we do on national defense. So she oversees all of that operation. The Food and Drug Administration, right below on the right in the center, is the organization that is responsible for testing any vaccines. And they have to go through clinical trials. You start with an experimental trial, and then if that works out, you scale it up a little bit. You do another trial, and if that works out, you go to full clinical trial where you have a larger sample, and then you have approval. President Trump has ordered them to work a little faster, and they are fast tracking, as it's called. They can waive certain rules and procedures, and usually time that must pass between the results of the first phase and the start of the second phase, in part because there needs to be sort of people looking at the results just to make sure the results are good. It's like a peer review process. And if you go to the bottom of that second column in the center there, you have the National Institute of Health. And that's where Anthony Fauci is. So let's go to their chart. They're kind of a different organization. And I accidentally highlighted the one below where Anthony Fauci runs. So if you look just one slice of thin pie right above where the red lines are, you have the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. That's the office that Anthony Fauci directs. And you see it's one of this giant wheel with the Office of Director in the middle. This is not the typical way that bureaucracy is structured. Usually it's much more hierarchical, where you have the boss, and you have the assistant boss, and you have the managers, and you have the people doing the work. Here, because it's a bunch of scientists and physicians, and because they're doing a lot of what we call basic research, they want to find things out. And they want to discover new things. They want to sort of test things. They want to understand the way science actually has an impact on human beings. This is highly specialized. And when you have that, you often have what's called the hub of the wheel style of organization, where the Office of Director, who is probably one of the most prominent scientists in the world, Collins is his name, he oversees sort of all these various divisions doing all this very specialized research. And so this kind of organization is the type of organization when each little slice is populated by people who know more than anybody else, arguably in the world, or at least in this country, about the particular title that of that office. And so National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Fauci oversees the team of experts who know more about that issue than anybody else. So this is not typical, but this is the way science-based, technocratic-based organizations are often organized. Because you have, it's kind of like PC. We have different departments, all with individual expertise, and you have the Office of the Provost is the middle. So it's the same kind of organization when our job is to know stuff. So what do they do? Well, I cut and pasted this right from their webpage. They seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. The amount that we spent in fiscal year 2020 on this is $6.1 billion on infectious diseases. That's Fauci's office. If you're bored or interested, I recommend you go to the link that I have here, the NIH budget report, for how much is spent on research. And what you will see is there's a wide variation in how much money we spend on different things. And sometimes it doesn't conform to the incidence of that particular disease or problem in the wider population. Most notably, you will see hypertension, which 26% of the adult population has in this country, gets only a couple $100 million a year, whereas other things get in the billions, as you see with infectious disease. Why? I want you to think about that. The answer is not evil. It's a natural function of our system. But I'm not going to tell you what it is, so maybe we have something to discuss in class. So that's all I have. I hope this is useful. If it's not, pretend it is and tell me it is, and then you can give me feedback later. All right, I hope you're doing well. Talk to you soon, maybe. Bye.